On the 8th of March 1964, Malcolm Little, better known as Malcolm X, announced his resignation from the Nation of Islam, the black Muslim movement in the United States that he had become the public face of since the mid-1950s. For years, X had helped grow the nation and recruit well-known African Americans like Muhammad Ali, but within weeks of leaving the nation, he was predicting that they would try to have him killed before long. What explains this violent split between him and the organization he once promoted? This is the story of Malcolm X and his assassination. The man known to history as Malcolm X was born in the city of Omaha in the state of Nebraska on the 19th of May 1925. He was baptized as Malcolm Little. He would only become known as Malcolm X in the 1950s, while he also used the name El Hajj Malik El Shabazz in the last year of his life. Malcolm's father was Earl Little. He was a carpenter who came from the small town of Reynolds in the state of Georgia, where he was born in 1890. He had married Louise Langdon, a woman who came from Grenada, a British colony in the Lesser Antilles region of the Caribbean. Louise's grandparents had been enslaved in Western Africa, perhaps in the region around modern-day Nigeria, and trafficked across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. This was in the final stages of the transatlantic slave trade, and they did not remain enslaved for long. Louise had moved to Canada as a young woman in 1917, where she met Earl in Montreal. They started their married life by moving south of the border to Philadelphia, where they had their first child, a daughter named Wilfred. They moved to Nebraska at the start of the 1920s. 6 further children were born between 1921 and 1929: Hilda, Filbert, Malcolm, Reginald, Wesley, and Yvonne. Malcolm was right in the middle of the 7 siblings. Malcolm was born in the middle of a turbulent time in American history. It's often underappreciated exactly how violent the United States was in the 1920s. A lot of this was owing to racial and ethnic tensions. Segregation had been in place in the post-Civil War South for decades and had created a hostile environment there. This was epitomized in the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma on the 31st of May and 1st of June 1921. The Greenwood district of the city had become known as Black Wall Street on account of the affluence of the African American community. That came to an end in the early summer of 1921 when thousands of black people were attacked and arrested, and over 30 blocks of buildings were set on fire and attacked in one of the worst incidents of intercommunal violence in American history. This came 2 years after the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots and attacks had led to hundreds of deaths in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and parts of Arkansas. And it wasn't just violence between white and black Americans in the 1920s. The influx of Roman Catholic Irish and Italians into the country and many Jewish people from the Russian Empire between the 1840s and the 1910s had sparked a wave of ethnic tensions. The membership of the Ku Klux Klan swelled as white Protestant Americans fell back on a strand of nativism which viewed the growing prosperity of African Americans in places like Tulsa or Atlanta, Georgia, or the taking over of large parts of cities like New York and Chicago by Irish, Italian, and Jewish migrants as a threat to the old order. These forces would shape Malcolm's life as they evolved and changed into the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. The one thing that his Baptist parents could not have expected is that Islam would also shape his life. When Malcolm was born in the 1920s, there were no more than a few thousand Muslims in the entirety of the United States. Malcolm's childhood was turbulent. His father was a tough man known for his temper. His past was murky too. Back in Reynolds, before he ever met Malcolm's mother, he had previously married a woman named Daisy Mason in 1909. They had 3 children together before Earl promptly abandoned his family to migrate north to Montreal, where he met and married Malcolm's mother. The Canadian marriage was bigamous. He had never obtained a divorce from his first wife in the US. Despite this inauspicious start, Earl and Louisa's marriage was more stable at first. They were both interested in the emerging black civil rights movement in the US after returning south of the border. In Nebraska, they were involved with the UNIA, a black nationalist movement founded by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican-born activist of the era who played a substantial role as well in the emergence of Rastafarianism. The Littles' activities as members of the UNIA created tensions in Omaha, and the family moved several times around the Midwest during Malcolm's youth, first to Milwaukee and then to Michigan. They were able to do so because Earl was a trained carpenter and could find work wherever he went in the 1920s as a building boom was underway across the US at the height of the Roaring Twenties. Finally, they settled in the eastern part of Chicago in 1929, where they purchased a 1.5-story farmhouse. Malcolm's father had overlooked a provision in the deed that stipulated that black people could not buy the house. White neighbors soon challenged the legality of the purchase in court. Before the case was ever heard legally, their house was blown up using a homemade explosive just after dawn on the 8th of November 1929. It was one of 4.5-year-old Malcolm's earliest memories. Undeterred by this latest bout of violence, Earl Little continued his activities with the UNIA and other nascent civil rights groups. After their close escape in 1929, the Little family relocated again, this time to Lansing in the state of Michigan. It was the last move for Earl Little. Malcolm's father was killed under mysterious circumstances on the night of the 8th of September 1931. He had been selling chickens in the city to make some extra money and had gone out to collect money owed for the birds. Late that night, Malcolm's mother was awakened by police at the door, who informed her that her husband was in hospital. He was horrendously injured, with a leg nearly having been severed and one of his arms disfigured. He died before Louise ever made it to the hospital to see him. The coroner's official report ruled that Earl had died accidentally after somehow being caught under a streetcar or tram in Lansing. Malcolm grew up confident that his father had actually been killed by members of the Black Legion, a more violent splinter group of the Ku Klux Klan that were highly active in the American Midwest between 1925 and 1937. After his father's death, things went from bad to worse for the Little family. Louise was now a widow with 7 children at the very height of the Great Depression. The family only barely survived on welfare payments in the years that followed. Eventually, after she became pregnant in 1937 by another man who quickly abandoned her, Louise's psychological state deteriorated and she was placed in an asylum in 1939. She would not be released for nearly a quarter of a century. Malcolm was quickly taken into foster care by neighbours of theirs in Lansing, who he had taken to visiting at mealtimes, Thornton and Mabel Goanna. The siblings were split up eventually, and a state welfare officer decided that Malcolm should be sent to Ingham County Juvenile Home in Mason, south of Lansing. The town, he later noted, was virtually devoid of black people. In spite of the extremely challenging circumstances of his youth and upbringing, Malcolm did do well in school. In his second semester at his high school in Mason, he was elected as class president, and he acquired a reputation for talking at length on political and social topics. In the summer of 1940, right after turning 15, he had a chance to head to a big city. He had started corresponding with Ella Little, one of his half-sisters from his father's first marriage. She was into her mid-20s and lived in Boston by then, after moving there from the South in search of work during the years of the Great Depression. After a few letters over and back, she invited him to visit, and so off he headed to New England. The trip was a revelation for Malcolm. His entire life up to that point had been lived against a backdrop of racial tensions in the Midwest, the probable murder of his father, and the deaths of several other extended members of his family. In Boston, He found a much more liberal environment for African Americans, and one where they would frequently mix quite easily with white neighbors, especially in the areas around the city's universities. When he returned to Mason again in the autumn of 1940, he couldn't settle. After a teacher suggested that his aspirations to study law after he left school were unrealistic for a black Midwesterner, Malcolm had enough. Regardless of his good performance in school, he had no interest now in living for several more years in Michigan. In 1941, he dropped out of high school and headed east to live with Ella in Boston. The idea was that he would enroll in a school there and finish his secondary education. However, all would not work out as planned. After he arrived to live in Boston on a more full-time basis, it soon became clear that the surface appearance of Ella's life in Massachusetts was not all that it seemed. She was an imposing woman of nearly 6 feet, and she worked in Boston as a floor manager in a department store. A lot of her work consisted in identifying and scaring off shoplifters. Before long, though, she was learning from their methods and began stealing from shops around Boston. This escalated into more serious crimes, and in 1936 she had been charged in court with assault and battery. In all, between the mid-1930s and the end of the 1950s, Ella was arrested 21 different times, although she was only ever successfully charged once. This was not an ideal role model for an impressionable 15-year-old to be living with. Before long, Malcolm was engaged in petty crime himself. He was also drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, neither of which he had ever touched in Michigan. By the end of 1941, even Ella was a bit concerned about Malcolm's swift descent into a life of crime. Early in 1942, he left Boston and headed south to Harlem in New York City. Though still short of his 17th birthday, he had a swagger to him. He swiftly acclimatized in Harlem to playing a role in the numbers game, the illegal lottery operated within African American communities there as a form of gambling. Malcolm also visited jazz saloons and began seeing a white woman by the name of B. Karagulian. She was of Armenian descent and was a dancer at several clubs he frequented, as well as being several years older than him. All in all, the transition from being a promising student in Michigan, albeit with a very troubled childhood, to becoming a street hoodlum in Boston and then Harlem was extremely fast for Malcolm Little. If nothing else, it demonstrated his precocious ability to adapt to new environments. It would soon land him in prison, too. By 1943, Malcolm was engaged in a range of criminal activities. He was racketeering, running illegal gambling operations, dealing narcotics, and was rumoured to even work occasionally as a male prostitute, though this latter story has never been fully proven. He avoided military service during the Second World War by pretending to be psychologically disturbed and disposed towards racial violence when he was interviewed by a draft officer. Conversely, the earlier stages of the war in 1942 had led to him briefly obtaining a job on board a passenger ship running between cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. on the coast. The boat workers who typically ran these ships had been some of the first called up to the U.S. Navy after the war began. He also worked at a restaurant on and off in Harlem in the later war years, a place called Jimmy's Chicken Shack, where he cleaned dishes. As the war came to an end in 1945, he decided to get out of Harlem for a while, where he had been observed by police for a time and had possibly upgraded to selling cocaine as well as marijuana. He returned to Boston briefly, where Ella was less than delighted by his presence. Malcolm's luck finally ran out here. In Boston, he was part of a small group of hoodlums who had an operation going to rob expensive watches from homes around the city and other parts of Massachusetts. They then had a fence who sold them on at a tidy profit. Their activities were being monitored before long by the police, and Malcolm was arrested in January 1946 after he returned to collect a stolen watch he had left to be fixed in a repair shop. He happened to be carrying a loaded firearm at the time and was charged with multiple offences. Although he was coaxed into informing on his accomplices in return for a promise that the firearm charge would be dropped, Malcolm was ultimately charged and convicted for all of the various crimes. He was sentenced to 3 concurrent 6 to 8 year sentences. At the time, he remarked to his lawyer that the sentence seemed unduly harsh and was partly because the police had learned that his girlfriend, B. Karagulian, was white. Malcolm spent the next 6 years in prison in several facilities in Massachusetts. The first of these was Charlestown State Prison. It had been built back when Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States at the start of the 19th century and was accordingly run down and infested with mice. Prisoners relieved themselves in buckets as there were few modern toilets. Understandably, Malcolm's psychological state while here was recorded as being moody and fatalistic by prison liaison officers. Things changed after he was sent to the Massachusetts Reformatory Prison at Concord in 1947 and then, in 1948, to the Norfolk Prison Colony, a much more modern prison opened in 1927. During this period, Malcolm committed himself to trying to turn his life around. He was a young man, and with good behavior, he could get out of prison early and start his life over. His siblings also began writing to him to tell him about the Nation of Islam, a growing black nationalist movement that had been founded in 1930 by African Americans who were interested in the idea of Islam being a unifying force for black Americans. While in prison, Malcolm began reading extensively and educating himself. He decided to join the Nation of Islam movement, and in the late 1940s he adopted the name Malcolm X. A core belief of the Nation was that African Americans had English-derived surnames like Little, Smith, Brown, and Johnson, which they should reject as slave names. In their place, they should take something simply, like X, as a surname. The Nation held that a person could later adopt an Islamic or Arabic surname, but only after many years of dedication. Thus, by the start of the 1950s, Malcolm went by Malcolm X. Malcolm was released on parole in August 1952 after serving 6.5 years in prison. He was committed to turning his life around and never returning to a life of drug abuse and petty crime. Instead, he would commit to the Nation of Islam. The leader of the organization was Elijah Muhammad, who was born Elijah Robert Poole. After he had taken over the nation in the mid-1930s, he had grown it from a small entity to a more national enterprise that soon had thousands of members and a growing number of chapters. These were in large cities and focused on the nation's own mosques, called temples. They were not associated with the more mainstream branches of Islam, such as Sunni or Shia Islam. Instead, they held that the nation's founder, Wallace Fard Muhammad, who had established the movement in Detroit in 1930, before disappearing under mysterious circumstances in 1934, had been a representative on earth of Allah, and that virtually all of the caliphs and imams worshipped by Shia and Sunni Muslims were not real prophets of Islam. As soon as Malcolm left prison, he traveled to Chicago to meet with Elijah Muhammad. He quickly became a very prominent member of the nation and spent the first years of his time as a free man traveling between Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and New York, helping to build up the nation's temples in these cities that had substantial African American populations. Malcolm was an excellent recruiter. He spoke well and was passionate in the way he promoted the new movement. Hence, by 1955, he wasn't just expanding existing temples, but was setting up new ones in cities like Hartford, Connecticut, and Atlanta, Georgia. He made a deep impression on people who attended meetings of the nation, standing 6'3" and possessed of impressive oratorical abilities. Through his organizational abilities, speeches, and sheer energy in promoting the nation, its numbers swelled from a few thousand when he was released from prison in 1952 to tens of thousands by the end of the 1950s. The exact figure isn't known. Estimates range from 25,000 to 50,000, with the figure probably being close to 35,000. Malcolm started a family after leaving prison as well. Previously, his most significant relationship had been with B. Karagulian. The perception that his prison sentence had been as harsh as it was in 1946 because of his girlfriend being white had entrenched him in his militantly pro-black nationalist views when he left prison, and there was no doubt that any future relationships he had would be with a black woman. He first met his future wife, Betty Sanders, in the middle of 1956. She came from Pinehurst in the state of Georgia, where she was born in 1934. Like Malcolm, she came from a family which was steeped in race politics during her childhood years, and, like him, she had a troubled youth, eventually being placed in a foster home in Detroit. After high school there, she began studying nursing and transferred to Brooklyn State College School of Nursing. Around the time she finished her undergraduate degree, a friend invited her to attend the Nation of Islam's temple in Harlem. Although she was skeptical after her first visit, on her second trip there, she heard Malcolm speak and was drawn to him. They soon began a relationship after meeting in a less formal setting at a Nation dinner party. Thereafter, she became a committed member of the Nation with the name Betty X. They were married in 1958 and had 6 children: Atola in 1958, Kabila in 1960, Ilyasa in 1962, Gamila Lumumba in 1964, and twins Malika and Malak, who were born after their father was killed in 1965. Their names were unusual. Kabila, for instance, was named after Kublai Khan, the famous Mongol emperor of the 13th century. Gamila Lumumba was named after the Congolese nationalist Patrice Lumumba. As Malcolm's post-prison life was materializing, there were bigger forces bringing change to life in the United States for the African American community. As Malcolm's own parents' activities as members of the UNIA and other civil rights groups decades earlier indicate, there was concerted pushback against segregation in the southern states and wider discrimination towards black people across America as early as the 1920s. This really took off in the aftermath of the Second World War. A driving force was the war itself, which had seen African Americans serve in large numbers against the Germans and Japanese, only to return to a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Living standards were also improving, and an emerging black middle class were better educated and better able to use both the courts and political organizations to lobby for an end to segregation and the creation of a more equal society. A major turning point came in 1954 when the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case Brown v. Board of Education, ruled that racial segregation in American public schools was unconstitutional. Additional incidents, such as the Montgomery bus boycott between December 1955 and December 1956, drew greater attention to the civil rights movement on the national stage. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to lobby as part of the civil rights movement, and they began to coordinate their efforts with existing groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union. That same year, President Dwight Eisenhower, whose role in the civil rights movement is frequently overlooked, passed a limited Civil Rights Act. It was not anywhere near as sweeping as what would follow in the 1960s, but contributed to the process of reform nonetheless. By the end of the 1950s, there was a huge civil rights movement developing across the country. Malcolm X would move in parallel to this for years to come, offering an alternative, more aggressive stance towards race relations in America. Malcolm X had become a figure of considerable significance within the Nation of Islam by the second half of the 1950s, and there were people who knew him beyond nation circles within the African American community in places like Harlem. However, he remained fairly obscure on the national stage. The average American had no idea who the man formerly known as Malcolm Little was. That changed overnight in late April 1957. On the afternoon of the 26th of April at 125th Street in the middle of Harlem, several members of the nation's Harlem Temple intervened when they came across 2 New York police officers beating a black man by the name of Reese Poe. One of the nation members was a man named Johnson Hinton. In the ensuing skirmish, he was beaten badly by the police officers, causing severe bleeding to his skull. Before long, word had reached Malcolm, and he and numerous followers headed down to the police station where Hinton and the others had been detained. He convinced the police that he needed medical attention, and Hinton was initially taken to hospital, but then he was sent back to the police station. Slowly, the crowd grew outside the 28th Precinct police station that night until there were an estimated 4,000 protesters there. Eventually, Malcolm succeeded in having Hinton sent back to the hospital, and he survived. But police were spooked by the entire event. A legal case followed, and the NYPD were forced to make a payment of $70,000. The entire episode made national news and cast Malcolm as the public face of a new movement. What was most striking, one police officer at the time had noted, was that X had been able to basically direct thousands of people that night, almost as though a small army in Harlem was under his control. The Hinton controversy in April 1957 introduced hundreds of thousands of African Americans to the Nation of Islam and made Malcolm X a national figure. While only a fraction of those who suddenly became aware of the movement joined, many more engaged with the nation on one level or another. Lectures at the Temple in Harlem and in other cities were suddenly seeing large crowds as the nation moved from being an overtly religious movement led by Elijah Muhammad to being more political, with Malcolm as a kind of public face of the entity. His statements during many of his lectures were very political. For instance, during a sermon in June 1957, 2 months after the Hinton incident, he stated that there is a pact of nations called the African Asia Bloc. It is a bloc comprised of some of the black nations on this earth. They are becoming stronger, and it is just a bit more proof that the black men are beginning to realize that there is strength in numbers. This was augmented by his statements that white people were devils, while the victory of black people over white people worldwide was impending. Malcolm seized the moment in other ways. A festival was organized in celebration of Marcus Garvey, a great hero of his parents in the 1920s, in Harlem in August 1957. All of these events saw membership expand considerably in Harlem in 1957 and 1958. Soon, Malcolm was traveling again very frequently. For instance, Elijah Muhammad gave him permission to head to Detroit to deliver a series of lectures at Temple No. 1, the first temple founded by the nation back in 1930. There, upwards of 4,000 people crammed into the temple to hear him speak. The militancy of his message was growing. In one of these sermons, he remarked, of the position of the black man in America, that if his most degrading situation did not change, then the little man in the street will henceforth begin to take matters into his own hands. It is not at all surprising that the FBI were monitoring Malcolm and the wider activities of the Nation of Islam by this time. They had a folder on him almost from the first moment that he left prison, as there was a fear that the nation and its members had communist leanings, and this was the height of the Red Scare in the US. They continued to monitor him closely throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, especially after the Hinton controversy in April 1957. Informants provided information on him, and his phones were eventually wiretapped. There was nothing too unusual about this during the time period. Martin Luther King's phone was also tapped, and he was monitored by the FBI, despite his movement being broadly less incendiary in terms of the language it used about white Americans. Still, as much as the FBI and other police services might have monitored Malcolm and investigated the wider activities of the Nation of Islam, there was little they could do unless he actually broke the law. An FBI report produced late in 1958 highlighted how difficult he would be to prosecute. It acknowledged that he had a strong hatred for the racial hierarchy that he believed prevailed in the country at the time, but that this hatred is not likely to erupt in violence, as he is much too clever and intelligent for that. It further stated that he is not likely to violate any ordinances or laws. He neither smokes nor drinks, and is of high moral character. Thus, even while they were monitoring him and they were aware of his antipathy towards white people, the FBI were conscious that Malcolm was shrewd and that he would not allow the nation to act simply as a violent and lawless group. Instead, he planned to continue building it as a militant black nationalist group that largely remained inside the law. In 1959, Malcolm became involved in a project that was being undertaken by an African-American journalist by the name of Louis Lomax and the television presenter and journalist Mike Wallace, who later went on to become synonymous with the investigative journalism show 60 Minutes. Lomax had piqued Wallace's curiosity about looking into different groups in African-American society in the US that were adopting a more radical approach than the civil rights movement. They started working on a show on black radicalism and nationalism, which they eventually named The Hate That Hate Produced. The idea being that they were exploring groups that hated white Americans because of the hate they had been subjected to over several centuries. The documentary looked at numerous groups, but it focused to a considerable extent on the Nation of Islam. Lawson interviewed Malcolm for the show. Despite the title of the documentary and the editorial angle, X's appearance in it when it was broadcast in 1959 increased his public profile, and he was increasingly sought out by television stations, radio channels, and newspapers to give his views on a range of topics, including his alternative approach to the pacifist civil rights movement. Effectively, Malcolm was growing to embrace his notoriety. This was seen not long afterwards when the new leader of Cuba, after the success of the revolution there at the very start of 1959, Fidel Castro, visited New York to attend the United Nations. Castro was viewed as a clear enemy of the United States and not exactly given a friendly welcome in the city, with orders that he was to stay within Manhattan after arriving there from the airport. Malcolm arranged for Castro and his Cuban entourage to stay at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, leading to a peculiar situation where leaders like Nikita Khrushchev of Russia and President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt made their way up to uptown Manhattan to meet the Cubans there. Malcolm and Castro only met once, and Castro's broken English and X's lack of Spanish evidently presented a barrier that was only partly overcome by Castro's translators. Back in 1958, an offer had been extended to Elijah Muhammad to visit Egypt as a guest of the government of President Nasser. Muhammad accepted the offer, but he decided to send Malcolm as his representative. After a delay over acquiring a passport, he undertook his first overseas tour as a senior figure within the Nation of Islam in the summer of 1959. He arrived at Cairo on the 4th of July. The trip to Egypt was meant to be brief, but he came down with dysentery and ended up holed up in the Egyptian capital, ill for nearly 2 weeks. It was a sign of his international status that many Egyptian politicians came to see him while in the city. Once he recovered, Malcolm and his party travelled onwards to Saudi Arabia. Afterwards, he visited numerous countries in Africa in the second half of 1959, including Sudan, Nigeria and Ghana, before returning back to the US in January 1960. The trip had changed his worldview, and he began to see the African-American situation in America within a more international context. In a letter which he wrote during his travels that was published in the Pittsburgh Courier, he stated that Africa is the land of the future. Only yesterday America was the new world, but now we suddenly realize Africa is the new world, the world with the brightest future. This was perhaps a little ambitious across a continent where colonialism was barely starting to come to an end and which would descend into decades of military dictatorships and tribal conflicts from the late 1950s onwards, though Malcolm was buying into the optimism of the age of decolonization in Africa. Following his travels, Malcolm's political outlook was expanding beyond a narrow focus on US affairs and the position of African Americans there. He was commenting on the Cold War in a more concerted way during this time. His argument, which it was hard to argue against, was that America preached about liberty and democracy on the world stage and yet continued to have inequality before the law at home, especially in the southern states where elements of segregation were still in place. His views had an internationalist tone to them when he argued that the struggle in the world was not between the United States-led Western Bloc and the communist nations led by the Soviet Union and China, but was instead between oppressors and oppressed, not what country was involved. This criticism of power structures within both camps on the Cold War aside, he did tend to express support more for left-leaning economic policies. Malcolm did not identify in a direct way as a Marxist or socialist. Instead, he critiqued capitalism as being a system which had fostered the growth of the transatlantic slave trade in centuries gone by and created power structures which favored white Westerners across the world. It was unsurprising that he was also critical of colonial activity in Africa and in favor of rapid decolonization at a time when France was fighting a bitter war to hang on to Algeria and Portugal was refusing to countenance giving up its colonies in Angola and Mozambique, although decolonization was advancing rapidly elsewhere. Because of his more aggressive stance and the more militant nature of the Nation of Islam in general, Malcolm X was appearing as the spokesperson of an alternative approach to the racial tension in America at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. To put it bluntly, it was a more aggressive approach than the more mainstream one led by Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm justified this on the basis that African Americans were being subjected to violent attacks in many places throughout the United States in the 1950s and into the early 1960s, so that aggressively fighting back was essentially self-defense. Clearly, X's own experiences as a child, during which time he believed his father had been killed by the Black Legion, informed his beliefs in this area. At the same time, there were striking examples of violence against Black Americans in the 1950s that perhaps justified this perspective as well. Take the example of Emmett Till, an African-American teenager from Chicago who, on the 28th of August 1955, was viciously lynched while visiting relatives in Mississippi. He was alleged to have simply offended a white person there and was killed at 14 years of age. His badly mutilated and bloated body was put on open display in the funeral home back in Chicago at his mother's request after being retrieved from a river in Mississippi. The incident caused national controversy when the killers were acquitted at trial. Events like this convinced many African Americans in the 1950s and early 1960s that the approach of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam was preferable to the civil rights movement, especially when they saw signs that the government of President John F. Kennedy seemed to be trying to delay the passage of new legislature to end segregation and racial discrimination, as the Democrats' traditional stronghold of support was in the southern states prior to the 1960s. For these reasons, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam gained in popularity in the late 1950s and early 1960s, despite his more militant approach. It's peculiar the way the clash between the pacifist civil rights movement led by King and the more militant movement associated with Malcolm played out in the early 1960s. Malcolm and King never debated each other. In fact, the two men only ever met each other once. This was on the 26th of March 1964 in Washington, D.C., during a debate before the Senate in the lead-up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Instead, King and Malcolm debated each other indirectly in print, in front of the cameras, and on radio. Malcolm was central to setting up Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper of the Nation of Islam in 1960, in order to promote the group's views. King had a pulpit wherever he went. Malcolm argued that King's approach took too nice a view of human nature and that African American rights would have to be fought for. King believed Malcolm was being overly militant. The two men respected each other, even though they disagreed fundamentally. This was despite a creeping violence within the Nation of Islam. It had taken years to establish nation temples on the West Coast, but By 1961, the organization had a solid base in California from which to expand. In late 1961 and into 1962, there were violent confrontations between nation members and the police in Los Angeles. In the period that followed, it became a pattern for nation members to arm themselves. Malcolm, who used militant language and viewed the struggle in America in militant terms, but who never resorted to violence again after his time in prison, was disturbed by this and viewed it more as criminality than coherent political action. It was the start of his disillusionment with the nation. A well-known element of Malcolm's life during the early 1960s was his friendship with Muhammad Ali. Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. had won a gold medal in the lightweight division at the Summer Olympics in Rome in 1960 when he was only 18 years old. 3.5 years later, in February 1964, he became the world heavyweight champion at 22 years of age when he defeated Sonny Liston after Liston failed to rise from his corner at the start of the 7th round. In the interim, between his victory in Rome and his becoming heavyweight champion of the world, Clay had taken an interest in the Nation of Islam. He and Malcolm first met in 1962 after Clay attended a nation meeting in Detroit. Thereafter, they became firm friends. Clay announced that he was officially a member of the nation in March 1964, a few weeks after becoming heavyweight champion. Initially, he took the name Cassius X, but Elijah Muhammad broke with convention to give him an Islamic name almost immediately, Muhammad Ali, a mix of the name of the Prophet Muhammad and his son-in-law Ali. This was a very difficult situation for Malcolm, as by the time Ali won the heavyweight title and announced his membership of the nation publicly, Malcolm was splitting from the nation himself. Their friendship ended at that point, as Ali chose to side with Elijah Muhammad and the nation. Nonetheless, it was a formative relationship in Ali's political awakening, and a lot of his views on politics, Africa, and race relations in the years that followed can be traced to Malcolm X's influence over him. Ali would eventually split from the Nation of Islam as well, though much later, in 1975. There were multiple reasons for Malcolm X's split from the Nation of Islam. Firstly, he had become disillusioned with the creeping violence and criminality which he saw the nation's new members and chapters engaging in. Secondly, he had serious concerns about Elijah Muhammad's leadership. Not only was he an increasingly authoritarian leader of the nation, he was a moral and ethical hypocrite. This was especially acute when it came to his sex life. Unlike nearly all strands of Islam which allow for polygamy, the ethos of the nation was that men and women should abstain from sexual relations before marriage, and once married, both men and women should be strictly monogamous. In this sense, the nation was adopting elements of Christian morality around sexuality and marriage into its ethics. However, in the early 1960s, it became clear to Malcolm that the leader of the nation was not practicing what his organization preached. He carried on numerous affairs with a string of young secretaries that he employed in his main headquarters in Chicago,